1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam? Welcome to the week 6 edition of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host, I am your guest, I am JMToWin. As always, throw this baby on 1.5x speed or 2x speed, and let's get started with what I kept thinking all week was week 5. I feel like I saved several of my notes this week. I put in a 5.25 or 6.25 for what week of the 25 season it is. I think I saved some of my early week notes as 5.25. It's week 6. Welcome to week 6 this week. So if you're new here, welcome to this podcast. Most of you are probably not new here, but always the YouTube algorithm, bringing in some new people. So just a quick rundown on what we use this podcast for. So I am one of the core content providers at oneweekseason.com. And I lay out my journal throughout the week. I'm basically, my entire life revolves around NFL this time of year. So I watch all the games and I am working through my thoughts on the upcoming slate in my journal throughout the week. On Fridays, I do my podcast with Pete Overzet on his channel. I do this Angles podcast. I do a show with Squirrel Patrol that's on the 1 week season and 4for4 YouTube feeds. And then I post my player grid in the Scroll. I continue to drop thoughts into my journal, which is in Discord throughout Friday night, Saturday night. And then I give an update in my player grid on Sunday morning that has basically my final player pool and my exposures. This week, if you are not an OWS member, the player grids are free. So that's my player grid, that's Mike Johnson's FanDuel and DraftKings player pool, that's Sonic's mass multi-entry pool, that's Pappy's player pool. So a lot of really tremendous DFS players. As we often talk about, DFS is not about knowing who the good plays are. DFS is not about just putting good plays onto a roster. DFS is about understanding strategy, game theory, roster construction in order to maximize our probabilities of first place finishes, because that's where the money comes from. No first place finishes on my end yet this year, but a few close calls, a second place finish in the face mask a couple weeks ago. And let's hunt down that first place finish this week, which is a really interesting sort of slate. So similar to last week, actually, usually talk about what the Angles podcast is. So what I try to do with the Angles podcast is basically make sure that we're not doing anything that's redundant, that we're not just doing this, covering the same things that I'm covering in the journal, covering the same things that I'm covering in the player grid. So this is an opportunity for me to talk through sort of high level how I'm seeing the slate. So I will hit on, if you've been reading my journal throughout the week, if you check out my player grid this weekend, there will be some overlap, but this is an opportunity for me to talk out loud through the macro angles that I'm seeing on the slate and how I'm thinking might be. Again, DFS is not about who the good plays are. DFS is about how we're putting a roster together. And so every week is its own unique puzzle, and we want to think about how do we solve this puzzle this week? How do we put together a roster to win this particular week? So this week is similar to last week. If you're an OWS member, free member, paid member, you get the Angles email each week where it's similar. We break down sort of some high level stuff, and Lorejo writes that email. And I love the email this week. And he was talking about how last week, and by the way, Lorejo, if you're watching this, I'm going to send you an email, just tell you how much I loved this week's Angles email, but you can hear it on here instead. So he was talking about how similar this week is to last week, but also how things that are similar are not always the same, right? And so kind of going through the differences between last week and this week as well. But similar to last week in that we have a team playing the Cowboys. And that's the first thing that stands out to me on this slate is passing attack against the Cowboys. So last week, if you tuned into the Angles podcast, read my content, my whole focus all week was Justin Fields is the best play on paper. But there are very clear paths to failure. And we drew up what those paths to failure were. Through the first 2.5 or 3 quarters of that game, everything was trending down those paths to failure, which is that the Jets refuse to trust Justin Fields to throw the ball until they absolutely have to. And then once they absolutely have to, the defense knows they absolutely have to. So the defense is able to play the pass, right? They're able to, be more aggressive with their pass rush. They're able to play pass defense instead of potentially calling some run blitzes or whatever. And so that puts them at a disadvantage, makes it harder for them to put up points. And so what we were looking at last week was there was a scenario in which the Cowboys, who are also not super aggressive on offense, the Cowboys could just stay ahead of the Jets so that the Jets, it was close enough throughout that the Jets were like, yeah, we can keep running the ball. We're just, a good drive and a turnover away from getting right back in this game. And that was kind of how the Jets played that game through most of it. And then thankfully for our Justin Fields rosters, he did get unleashed down the stretch, and he was able to put up one of the top DraftKings scores on the slate. But what I kept talking about last week was this is a very sharp play from an upside perspective, but it's also very fragile. And if this play misses, what wins instead? So this week, it's kind of the same question for me, where Bryce Young is now the quarterback against the Cowboys, but it's even more fragile than last week. And so what was fragile last week was obviously, I think if we said who's a better quarterback, realistically, probably Bryce Young over Justin Fields, just a raw quarterback. But with Justin Fields, when he's dropping back to pass, we know that he's going to take shots downfield, he's going to be aggressive, and he's going to run the ball a lot, which just elevates our opportunity for fantasy points. So who's a better fantasy quarterback? Justin Fields. Who has more outs as a fantasy quarterback? Justin Fields. And so we have this situation where Bryce Young is more fragile from a fantasy perspective than Justin Fields was last week. And so again, if Bryce Young doesn't hit, who does? Before we talk about who does, Bryce Young, let's talk through some numbers. So I think one of the things that we need to make sure that we drill into our heads is that Bryce Young does have ceiling. We don't like playing him because we look through the game logs and it's like 11 points, 12 points, 14 points. Hey, 14 points, pretty good game for Bryce Young. But he does have ceiling. So across his last 11 games, he has games of, so again, he's 4,800, 4,700, 4,800. I've built like 18 Bryce Young practice builds this week. I should know his price tag, 4,800. He's played, or across his last 11 games at 4,800. He has put up scores of 23.6. So envision this, you're paying 4,800 for any player, but also a quarterback, paying 4,800, 23.6, 26.3, 27.1, and 36.4. If you get 26 or 27 points at a 4,800 quarterback, you are so far ahead of the field because a lot of people, we don't really have pay up options this week, but a lot of people are happy to pay $7K for a quarterback and they get those 25 to 26 points and they're like, man, that's a pretty good score. We're going to play Puka this week at 8,700, recognizing that he probably, yes, the matchup's great, but game environment probably would need to support his pathways to getting to like 35 to 40 points, right? We're playing Puka because his chances of getting 20 plus and also like 24, 25 plus are so much higher than other players that we're like, yeah, he's probably not putting up 35 to 40. He's probably not putting up 4x his nearly 9K salary, which would be, he needs like 35 points to truly pay off his salary. But it's like, yeah, but he's getting points and points are valuable. It's hard to get points on a roster if you can just guarantee you're getting points at this one spot. And if you're not having to stretch salary too thin in order to get it, let's do it, right? 26 points, 27 points. If we get that from Puka, we're going to be happy. He's going to be 30% owned, 40% owned. It's going to be like, yeah, this isn't winning me a tournament, but I'm happy I paid 8,700 to get these points. Well, Bryce Young has done this in, 26 plus in 3 of his last 11 games, 23.6 plus in 4 of his last 11 games. Now, caveats here, obviously, teams develop throughout the season. Most of these were late season games last year for Bryce Young, right? 3 of these 4 games were late in the season last year where this offense had hit its stride. It was looking much better than it had looked earlier in the season. And earlier in the season, Bryce Young had gotten benched, right? Then he came back and it was like, hey, Bryce Young showing some stuff. And then as the season moved along, it was like, oh, this is actually looking really good. And that's where we were with Bryce Young. We're not there right now. Furthermore, what typically goes wrong with Bryce Young is self-inflicted. So matchup against the Cowboys, awesome. How much does it matter for what typically trips up Bryce Young? What typically trips up Bryce Young are these off-target throws. I think he has, I was looking at, I think it was on stat rankings earlier this week, and it was one of the lowest on-target throw rates in the NFL so far this year. Bad fumbles. He had that fumble last week where he's just holding the ball in front of him as he gets hit. I forget who it was that got behind and like basically just knocked the ball right out of his hands. Soft fumble there, bad interceptions. So the matchup doesn't necessarily, it increases his chance of hitting, but not dramatically, right? Now, game environment is a benefit here because the Cowboys offense is so good that even though they're not inherently an aggressive offense, and I'll put this out here, I think this is important to recognize and to recognize before the field does. We've been talking about this for 2 or 3 weeks now, but the Panthers are not a bad defense anymore. They're not good, but they're not a bad defense. They're also not a bad run defense anymore. Derek Brown being back and healthy this year has made a big difference for this run defense. It's tough to run up the middle against this defense. They're not a bad run defense, but they're also not good. And the Packers, the Cowboys just put up 40 points on the Packers. We know the Packers are a good defense. The Cowboys matchup doesn't matter, which when generally speaking, that's the case, right? Different defenses are good at different things. Some defenses are good at confusing quarterbacks. Some defenses are good at just making everything a tight window throw difficult on a play-to-play basis. Some defenses are like the Rams. They're going to give up yards. They're going to let teams march the field, but they're going to – an offense gets about 10 drives per game. If you can disrupt most of those drives one time, right, where 2nd and 7 becomes 3rd and 14. It's tough for most teams. If you don't have Josh Allen, it's tough to convert a 3rd and 14, right? And so if you can get this sack or force a holding penalty or whatever it is, just a few times per game and disrupt those drives, that's another way that some defenses can be good. So there's different types of good defenses, but generally an elite offense or an offense that's operating at an elite level can outperform a good defense, right? All of the rules in the NFL are tailored toward helping the offense, tailored toward helping the quarterback. It was interesting. Dean Blandino was on Check the Mic this week, Check the Mic on the 33rd team. Steve Palazzolo, Sam Monsoon, used to be the PFF guys, and now they're with the 33rd team. And Dean Blandino was, he was on there. They were asking questions, and Dean Blandino just kept talking about, this because it protects the quarterback, this because it increases scoring, and that's what the NFL wants, right? And he was basically talking about rules through those lenses, right? Protecting the quarterback and increasing opportunities for points to be scored. So all the rules are in favor of the offense. A really good offense can typically find a way to get it done against a good defense if they are like on point, right? And so that's the level the Cowboys have been at lately. They should be able to do well against this average-ish Panthers defense. And so the game environment also works in Bryce Young's favor. Again, the matchup works in his favor. How much does that matter? We'll have to see. Another note, I was looking on stat rankings earlier in the week, which again, just throwing it out there, I'm going to throw it out there every week for you guys. Stat rankings is completely free, and they have tons of stats that are paywalled on most sites. So is stat rankings going to be free next year? I don't know. We'll find out. But for now, stat rankings continues to be free for this entire season. New site launched by Kevin Adams, formerly launched FTN, DFS Guru Elite, and now Stat Rankings free this year. And so you can get lots of cool stats on there. And I was on there looking at Bryce Young's completion rate, zone versus man this year. And I think it was 64% completion rate against zone and like 44% against man. Well, the Cowboys are the zone heaviest team in the NFL. So there's a lot of things that work in our favor here with this matchup. Again, that's not the total boost that we need it to be, because Bryce Young could still make the mistakes themselves. This offense could still make the mistakes themselves. I do think that Jalen Coker coming back helps this offense stay on track. But again, there are clear opportunities for this to play to the downside. So if it does, what ends up winning? So last week, I ended up with Justin Fields on about 30% of my rosters. Maybe it was 25. Yeah, it was 30% of my bankroll was on Justin Fields. Another 30% or so was on Jared Goff, and about 20% was on Bryce Young. And then I mixed and matched Herbert and Kyler and Jake Browning behind that. Sam Darnold was one of the satellite pieces sort of around there. I kept being like, what about Darnold? Maybe Darnold over Browning, maybe Darnold over Kyler. Didn't end up pulling the trigger there. So that would have been nice, but that's kind of where I'm at again this week. So yesterday I said in my journal, I said that I'm kind of trying to decide, is this a week where I go like 50 to 70% Bryce Young and like a broad mix and match behind, or if it'll be more similar to last week, leaning out of the mic to let a cat out of my office, or if it'll be more similar to last week where it's like, three different guys with relatively equal exposure and then a mix and match behind that. So again, I've been playing single entry 3 max lately, using the Big Machine Optimizer as like a massive tool for me in building. Last week it was about 2,000 rosters that I built between like 60 hand builds and then a bunch of different roster sets, different projection blends, different projection sets, different rules, different sets of players in the Big Machine, and just seeing what kept showing up, giving me different ideas and things to play around with. And then basically taking like 20 rosters, somewhere around 20 rosters, and putting it into single entry 3 max. And so I've got my typical 6K in play, but instead of having that with 25% of that being in MME, instead it's all in single entry 3 max right now, but basically treating it as like a mini multi-entry where it's like, okay, I want 5% of my bankroll on this quarterback. So, I'll put him in a $150, power sweep, 3 max power sweep. That's this size power sweep. There's three different power sweeps that are different sizes. And so it's like this quarterback fits in this, like the Jake Browning, right? Goes into the largest size power sweep. I don't even know if I put him in the power sweep. He ended up being the best quarterback of Herbert and Kyler and Bryce Young. And in terms of price, Jared Goff as well. Browning spite of how ugly that game was, put up, I think, 21 DraftKings points at a cheap price tag, but didn't feel confident enough to put him as one of my higher allocation guys. But it's like, okay, he belongs in this type of contest. Let me do that. So going back to how I'm attacking this week, what I'm starting to think right now is this Cowboys-Panthers game environment, and maybe setting aside 50% of my bankroll allocation to that game environment. So it's not all Bryce Young, maybe it's 30% Bryce Young, 20% Dak Prescott, and say, hopefully this game takes off. Now, in order for it to take off, it requires Bryce Young playing well, the Panthers playing well, but also Dak Prescott has been so on fire. The touchdowns could come through Rico Dowdle, or Bryce Young could only throw for 200 yards, maybe he throws for a couple scores, and the Panthers end up scoring 27 and the Cowboys end up scoring 37, something like that. But the Cowboys being pushed enough in order for us to have this type of game environment that we would like to have here, in which case Dak Prescott could end up throwing 4 touchdown passes and be the quarterback that you had to have. And then the other 50% of my bankroll allocation, sort of mixing and matching different pieces. Similar to last week, though, who are those different pieces? It's kind of hard to suss this out and figure out where the highest upside is. So there's some certainty in places, but where's the highest upside? What's going to win us a tournament this week? That's the question. So let's take a look at a few different spots. I don't have any key decisions made yet. Well, I do have my player grid kind of mapped out, so I do have some key decisions made. But again, when I publish the player grid, we always publish the player grid on Friday evening. I don't consider myself to be completely locked into like, hey, these are the guys I'm playing. It's creating the player pool Thursday night. I am writing the article on Friday after I finish my podcast. And so there are times where it's Friday night, I end up seeing, oh, you know what? I haven't really been on this guy. Let me get on to him. And he becomes 20% of my player pool. And then obviously that gets updated in my journal throughout the weekend. And then on my Sunday morning, updated in the player grid where it's, I publish it at like midnight on the West Coast. And so if you are on the East Coast, that's there when you wake up. And it has my exposures, basically like how I'm actually attacking the slate. Typically reflects what the player grid is. But again, there are changes from the player grid to kickoff. And so yeah, right now my player grid's set, but I'm also still working through all of this. So I set aside some quarterbacks to talk about here. One of them I want to talk about is Justin Herbert. Justin Herbert popping a lot for me in the optimizer this week, right? The projections like Justin Herbert this week. He's playing against a Miami defense that is one of the worst in the NFL. It's like historically bad against the pass, but because they're also so bad against the run, they're not seeing a lot of volume against him. So kind of like Jackson Smith and Jigba is been as good as Puka this year. He just doesn't see the volume, right? The Miami pass defense has been as bad as the Dallas pass defense this year. They just don't see the volume against them because teams are attacking them on the ground. The Chargers have been bad at running the ball, right? They lost Joe Alt. They lost Rashawn Slater. They're banged up on the offensive line. They're not good at running the ball right now. And then on top of that, they've lost both of their running backs. And so do the Chargers continue with this? Last week they kind of swung back over to being more run heavy, which is kind of the Greg Roman MO over decades. They've swung back toward that, but do they go back toward being more passive, right? They were one of the highest pass rate over expectation teams through the first 4 weeks of the season. It was sort of surprising. It's not typically what we expect from a Greg Roman offense, and they have been doing this this last week. And so this is a spot where we have to say, do the Chargers say, look, we can attack on the ground with our backup running backs and win this game in that way? We also have a good defense that should be able to slow down this Miami offense, this Miami passing attack. And so is that how the Chargers end up attacking here? Or do the Chargers say, okay, we are dropping back to pass. We're trusting Justin Herbert that he can dice up this secondary. One of the interesting things too about this Chargers passing attack, this Chargers offense as a whole, is they don't really keep opponents off balance. And keeping an opponent off balance isn't something you can look at in the data or the analytics, and it's not even something you can clearly define, but there is a visual component when watching games of teams that they're stretching the defense horizontally, vertically, they're running to the left, they're running to the right, they're running up the middle, they've got play action off of all of that. They have plays that are built off of that play action. They have pre-snap motion that is basically pulling the defense one way, the other way. The Chargers are not a team like that. They are more a team that's like, hey, our guys are going to go out there and beat your guys. So from that standpoint, a week like last week where we saw the Chargers really not look right against a Washington defense that was basically able to say and the Washington defense isn't even all that talented. They were able to say hey, with how bad your pass blocking is, we can get after you and just stop your guys, right? The Dolphins are less capable of just stopping the Chargers guys. Now, they do have a good pass rush with Jalen Phillips, with Bradley Chubb. Bradley Chubb's not elite, especially not anymore. Jalen Phillips, before all the injuries, was on that cusp of being an elite player, but still a very good player here. Chop Robinson can always bring heat. And so the Dolphins have potential to just disrupt this game for the Chargers. There's potential for the Chargers to say, hey, let's put the ball in Herbert's hands. Let's drop back and pass against this bad pass defense. And for things to still not work out for them, similar to that game against Washington, where we're not scared of Washington's secondary. Teams have been picking apart Washington's secondary all year, but the Chargers weren't able to do it because Herbert had no time to throw in that game. He was constantly under pressure, constantly having to get out of the pocket, try to keep his eyes up, throw the ball on the run. And so we could have a little bit more of that this week. So Herbert, sort of a broad range of outcomes and a lot of guesswork on how he's going to be used in this game and then how that actually ends up playing out. On top of all that, it's not easy to play in Miami in October. You have heat and humidity that your body's not used to. So yeah, a lot of interesting components here with Herbert. We also have Drake May sort of in a similar bucket where if we just say, who's going to outscore most of these other quarterbacks we're going to talk about today, who's going to outscore them most often, I would put Drake May up there near the top. But who has like a 30-pointer most often? Who has the most 30-pointers in a 100-game sample from this slate? It's probably not Drake May, right? We probably get more 30-pointers from Trevor Lawrence and Bryce Young, these guys who we have low confidence in, than we do from Drake May, just because of the nature of how this game is likely to develop. The Saints have not scored, I think it's 20 points is what they've topped out on offense. They scored whatever it was, 26 last week. There was a defensive touchdown in there. The Saints are one of the lowest explosive play rate teams in the NFL. They have that big play to Rashid Shaheed, but everything on the Saints is short area throws and trying to march the field. And so I won't go super deep into this. I broke it down I think I broke it down in my journal, and maybe it was thoughts I set aside for the player rib, but you find it somewhere. But I broke down some deeper thoughts on why Drake May's ceiling is capped in a likeliest run out here. So obviously weird things can happen in an NFL game. You can post a tournament winning game, but the likeliest scenario here is that we get the 17 to 23 points from Drake May, which is really solid. And then the question is this a slate where none of the other 19 quarterbacks go for 28 to 30, which is unusual? Or is it a slate where maybe one quarterback or two quarterbacks do it, but it's spots that nobody's on and that's really hard to see? Sam Darnold last week, CJ Stroud last week, in which case, in smaller field single entry, you probably don't have to worry about that anyway. But we should be hunting the spots where we could get those scores. So I could see if I go 50% Bryce Young, Dak Prescott, I could see myself having 5 other quarterbacks that is 10% allocation a piece to, and I could see May being one of those guys where I basically just say, all right, I might not be able to guess on who hits the 30-pointer. There probably will be a 30-pointer because there typically is one quarterback who does that, 27, 28, 29, 30. But if I can get 22 from Drake May, that might be good enough, right? So that's kind of where Drake May is at for me, sort of in a tighter range of expected scoring. Daniel Jones, Daniel Jones, Lord Reeves had this stat in the worksheet this week over at Sharp Football Analysis. Lord Reeves, you can also catch him on Searching for Ceiling on the 1 Week Season podcast feed with Hilo, one of the all-time sharps in DFS content and fantasy content. Anyhow, Lord Reeves had this stat that I think it was Daniel Jones is the number 1 fantasy quarterback in the first half of games this season, and then near the bottom of the league in the second half of games. So it's just that the Colts have been so in control of things as they move through games. The Cardinals defense, we perceive it as being solid. They've gotten better players than they had in the past. They've always been giving teams kind of issues, but also they've played kind of nobody this year. And then the Colts are good, right? The Colts are really good on offense. They're well schemed. Daniel Jones is running this offense really well. The big concern here is, can the Cardinals keep pace? The Cardinals offense has been really disjointed. Now we've got the Kyler Murray foot issue. So either Kyler Murray is playing without his mobility, his typical mobility, or we have Jacoby Brissett. So there's certainly concerns here about the game environment playing out in such a way that Daniel Jones can post a high-end game. Daniel Jones also is not getting schemed rushing attempts in this offense. He is not scrambling as much in this offense because there are answers for him all over the place in terms of, hey, if this is covered, here's your check down. If this is covered, look here, go here. And so, and a lot of times it's, if this is covered, look here, and this guy, you're going to throw it to him at the line of scrimmage, but there's going to be a blocker in front of him, right? So it's things are designed for, if this is covered, we can still pick up the 4 to 6 to 7 yards. And so Daniel Jones is not just taking off and running like he was in the past. You get the 3 rushing touchdowns. They were all from the 1 yard line in the first 2 weeks of the season, where we are also at risk of Jonathan Taylor taking those touches instead of Daniel Jones. And so, Daniel Jones, if you take away his rushing scores, he's been under 20 DraftKings points in every game so far this season. And so the question is, does he get the rushing scores, or does this become a game where the Cardinals are really pushing things? So if I'm playing Daniel Jones, I want to have Marvin Harrison Jr. or Michael Carter or Trey McBride. I want to be betting on the Cardinals doing well here instead of just saying, hey, cross my fingers, hopefully I get the rushing touchdowns from Daniel Jones at the 1 yard line, which, it's not, it can happen, but it's not what you want to be drawing up your weekend based on. And so you can kind of think of it as like if there were a prop bet for Daniel Jones 1 yard rushing touchdowns, like what odds would you feel comfortable taking that at? Because that's essentially what you're betting on Daniel Jones doing when you're putting him on a roster in order to help you win a tournament, unless you're instead saying, no, this game environment takes off. The Cardinals push this. Daniel Jones having to stay aggressive throughout. So Daniel Jones rosters ideally should have Cardinals on it just for the math to work in your favor. Matthew Stafford, another one where it's like the ceiling is there, but what has to happen for him to get there, right? He's done it in back-to-back weeks, but in very competitive games. He's a pocket passer, right? We need the 300+ yards. We need ideally 3 touchdowns, but at least 2 touchdowns. And the 2 or 3 touchdowns he can get there against Baltimore. Can he get to the 300+ yards? That's the big question. We know that the Rams are always content and willing to run the ball in the red zone inside the 10-yard line. And so the angle I like here with Stafford is, man, Cooper Rush, we came into last week saying Cooper Rush can keep this Ravens offense on schedule. They can do a good job. Cooper Rush is 9-5 as a starter. He did a good job in that Cowboys offense. He was able to feed CeeDee Lamb. Why are we all so convinced that this is going to be another blowout like last week? And what's especially interesting to me, I talked about this early in the week in the journal, is what makes the Texans defense good is that they're just really, really difficult to move the ball on a play-by-play basis. Every single play, it's a challenge to pick up those few yards. The Rams are not like that. What makes the Rams really good is that they have this disruptive front that can blow up drives, right? So you're driving the field, you picked up a first down, another first down. Now you're picked up another first down. You're on the other team's 40-yard line. You're getting close to field goal range. And all of a sudden, the Rams rush breaks through, and now you've got 2nd down and 19, and you're at the 49-yard line. And now your thoughts shifted to like, can we pick up the first down? You're trying to get 6 or 7 yards so that you're on schedule for 3rd down. And you're thinking, can we get like in field goal range? We're probably more focused on that than trying to get that first down. And so that's sort of how the Rams are good, right? They're not super difficult on a play-by-play basis. And so I do think there's clear potential for Cooper Rush to play well here. And for this to be a competitive game, and then you have Matthew Stafford plus Puka Nacua, maybe plus Devontae Adams or plus Kyron Williams, plus Zay Flowers, something like that, where you're saying, what if this game stays competitive? What if the Ravens keep this one close? And so that's the angle I like playing on Stafford. Then we've got 2 game environments that stand out. And this is certainly one of the places where my mind is gravitating toward, and that is the Jags hosting the Seahawks, so Trevor Lawrence and Sam Darnold, and then the 49ers and Buccaneers. So you got Baker Mayfield and Mac Jones. And I think that, is Baker Mayfield kind of overpriced? Yes, but let's throw that out, right? If we're just thinking like, where could a game take off to where tournament winning scores are being produced? Like if we're just trying to cash in tournaments, Baker doesn't stand out as a great play because he's so pricey for, if he gets 17, 18, 20 points, you can get that somewhere else. But what we're talking about is, what if there's a game that takes off? What if there's another 38-35 type game in here, which, Baker, last year, the Bucs had 8 games of 30+ points scored. They allowed 30+ points in 4 games. We know that the 49ers offense is going to continue to find answers regardless of who's on the field. And so that's a game that could shoot out. Trevor Lawrence, if he's able to pull things together and play well consistently against a really good defense. Obviously there's injuries for the Seahawks, but they're still a really good defense. But if Trevor Lawrence is able to pull that consistency together, that game could also take off. So focused on those 2 spots as well. We'll leave deeper dives on that to the journal, to the player grid, but just sort of gives you a feel for how I'm looking at quarterbacks on the slate. And realistically on a slate like this, where I'm saying I might have 50% on Baker and Bryce Young, and I'm not super confident in it. And then I might mix and match 5 other guys at 10% bankroll allocation apiece, and I'm not super confident in any of them. On a week like that, if you're seeing an angle I'm not talking about, it's probably still sharp, right? So whether it's Jordan Love or whether it's Tua or I don't know, whatever else you're going to this week, it's probably still sharp. So consider different angles as well as sort of the nature of the quarterback position this week. Very different from the nature of the running back positions. Third week in a row where I've had sort of a bigger pool at running back. This week it's 3, 6, 8 guys on my list. You could add a 9th guy who's not on this list. And I don't want to tighten this list down because all of these are good plays. And the last 2 weeks, it was similar for me where it was like, we got a pretty good sized pool of good plays. And I let the slate dictate what I'm doing, right? I don't try to force anything. So if there are only 3 running backs I like on a slate, I'm not going to say, I got to add a bunch of other guys so that I have, a mix and match. And so that if these guys miss, whatever. No, if there's only 3 really strong plays, that's what I'll play. If there are 8 really strong plays, I don't want to force saying, well, this guy's marginally better than this guy, or I better take a stand on this guy. Instead, I want to say, okay, I might have 40% of this guy and 20% of this guy, but I'm going to mix and match these guys. And the last 2 weeks, just mixing and matching from the sharp pool of running backs got you access to lots of 20, 25, even 30-point scores, even 37-point scores. Is that what Rico Dowdle put up last week? Shout out to Rico Dowdle. But this is a spot where, another spot where there's a pretty good-sized running back pool. So just throwing these names out there real quickly: Christian McCaffrey, Josh Jacobs, Kyron Williams, Javonte Williams, Rico Dowdle, Jonathan Taylor, Ashton Genty, Rashad White. There's another guy that we'll hit on in the player grid as well. But just a quick look at how I'm seeing the running back position, very similar to last week and the week before. At wide receiver, kind of expected, right? Where we have a week where we don't love the quarterback setup. It's kind of expected that we might not love the wide receiver setup. So we're going to talk a few things. We're going to talk Puka. We're going to talk JSN. We're going to talk this moderately stacked mid-range, and we're going to talk the intriguing low range. Puka. So Puka, we touched on this earlier, but he's probably not winning you a tournament at this price tag. He's probably not a key decision point, but he can be, right? And so I mentioned this on my show with Pete. There was, these are not the only examples, but just remembering a week, it was before I even started 1 week season, I think. So it was like 2017, but where Antonio Brown was over 50% owned playing against the Raiders. He was still at the Steelers playing against the Raiders. He was over 50% owned, and he put up like 55 DraftKings points. Well, that didn't win you the tournament. You were still competing against 50% of the field for first place, but if you didn't have him, you were completely washed, right? I think it was 3 years ago, there was a week where Devontae Adams was over 50% owned and ended up putting up 45 or 48 DraftKings points. Again, same thing. If you didn't have him, you didn't have a shot on this week. And then we had the Puka 39-pointer earlier this year where he was 50% owned, didn't win you a tournament, but if you didn't have him, you were really struggling to get up there on that particular week. And so that's why I like Puka, because his likeliest output in this spot, similar to old school Christian McCaffrey, his likeliest output in the spot is like 24 to 27 DraftKings points. Maybe he gets up 28, 29 DraftKings points, and that doesn't win you a tournament, but also that's a really solid score. Yes, you kind of overpaid for it, but it's hard to get 25-point scores. And some slates, there's not very many of them. So any place where it's like, there's a pretty confident bet that we can get 25 points here, it's fine to take it. Now, obviously, there are going to be those games where he puts up 35 to 40. There are going to be those games where he puts up 12 to 15. Those are within the range of outcomes, but the likeliest outcome is just this solid score. So because he's capable of putting up 40, because he's highly likely to put up 25 plus, I want to have a lot of exposure to Puka, but also because he's likely to put up 25 in the 25-point range and is capable of putting up 12 to 14, I also don't want to just say every roster is starting with Puka, right? Now, if Puka were priced at 6,500 and we're saying, dude, this guy's going to score 25 plus points most games, just play him everywhere. If he scores 12 points, fine. People who took a stand, good on them. But when we're getting up to this 8,700 price tag, and we don't have a week like last week where it's like, you guys, Rico Dowdle, we kept saying last week was Rico Dowdle could have the highest running back score on the slate, and he's 4,300, right? It's not like we're saying, hopefully this guy gets some points. Hopefully he's good at his salary. We're saying, no, he could put up one of the top scores on the slate and he's 4,300, just play him. Well, if we had that type of value, then it could be like, yeah, and take Puka everywhere as well. This week, not quite like that, but I will have plenty of Puka. He's a very sharp way to play. He's just not a guy that you have to go out of your way to force him onto rosters in terms of the math on this particular slate. JSN is a clear tier below Puka, which is interesting because on like rate stats, on per routes run, on per target type stats, JSN is very closely matched with Puka. They're basically the same wide receiver this year. But again, the everything the Seahawks offense is built off the run and the run action, and they've got these two running backs, and they're giving both them, 13, 15 carries a game. And so the passing volume, even in these higher scoring games, is not there for JSN to get these, consistent double-digit target games. So JSN, one game of double-digit targets this year, a couple games of like 5 and 6 targets this year. And so that's within his range of outcomes. Still a very, very sharp play this week. Again, he's a step below Puka, one of the sharper wide receiver plays, especially when we get below him and we realize there's just a lot of uncertainty at the wide receiver position. So I'm going to go down to this mid-range where I said kind of stacked mid-range and kind of stacked in that there's ceiling throughout, but the floor is low throughout. So Brian Thomas Jr., we went back to last year, right? We've talked about this since week 1. BTJ's big games last year came with Mac Jones. Our perception around Brian Thomas Jr., him being ranked above the league neighbors in the top 100, in the NFL top 100 last year, it was because of his hot stretch down the end of the season, right? It was like the last 5 games of the year where every week he was putting up monster scores. Well, every week that was Mac Jones under center. Before that, he put up 1 big score all season with Trevor Lawrence, and now this year 0 big scores so far. So we have almost a full season's worth of games of him and Trevor Lawrence not really being in sync. But the ceiling is still there, right? He can still put up a 30, 35-point game. It's just the consistency isn't there. The likeliest scenario is he doesn't do that, but we have to account for it because if we get 30-pointers from this range, you have to have them, right? So we have to be thinking about who could do it. I threw out this last week, Jalen Waddle. Last week, Tyreek Hill had, I think it was 3 games last year, over 14.3 DraftKings points. Maybe it was 4 games or 5 games, but it was like, what are the chances that Jalen Waddle is going to do dramatically better this year than Tyreek Hill did last year without Tyreek Hill or without another alpha wide receiver to draw attention away? He went out and put up 26 DraftKings points last week in a relatively tough matchup against a Carolina team that doesn't give up a lot of receptions and yards to wide receivers. Another tough matchup this week against the Chargers. But again, he's going to be heavily involved. He's capable of putting up one of these bigger games, so got to keep him in mind. Tetairoa and McMillan continue to see elite alpha usage, but with not an elite alpha quarterback. And so that is holding him down, but the upside is there. We mentioned Zay Flowers. We know Quentin Johnston is still capable of producing, especially against this bad Miami secondary, if the volume is there. A lot of people are going to be on Stephon Diggs. I think we're likely to see 5 to 7 targets in this spot because we're likely to see Drake May throwing the ball. His over-under for pass attempts, I think, is 30.5. So we're likely to see him in that range. Stephon Diggs played less than 50% of the snaps last week in that revenge game against the Bills. But again, he's capable of doing it. Ladd McConkey, Keenan Allen, if we're going to go to the Chargers. Marvin Harrison Jr., and there's other guys in here as well. But Marvin Harrison Jr., a guy who continues to show life and hit these big plays. I like him more if Kyler Murray plays versus Jacoby Brissett because it's harder for me to see Brissett taking those downfield shots and actually hitting them. But Marvin Harrison Jr., very viable in a game where the Cardinals are likely to be chasing points. And then we've got 4 guiders, right? Is it Kendrick Bourne? Is it Juwan Jennings? Whoever's out there as the number 1 is very viable this week. Trey Tucker is out there all the time, still seeing, he's going to have these games of 7, 8, 9 targets, and he's capable of hitting for big plays. So the floor is low, the ceiling is high, but we're probably going to see at least 1 really strong score emerge from this price range, possibly 2 or 3. They're all kind of low probability with low floors, but the ceiling is there throughout this price range. And then there's an intriguing low end of the price range. So we get down to 4,200 where Jalen Coker is coming back. How many snaps does he play? I don't know, but he's certainly viable this week. We have Torrey Horton, who continues to be a big part of this passing attack for the Seahawks. Double-digit DraftKings points in 3 of his last 4 games, including 18.2 against New Orleans. He's only 4,100. Downfield roll, low targets, so it's high variance. There's going to be some low scores mixed in, but he's going to have more games this year where he's putting up big scores as well. Alec Iomenor is continuing to be part of this Titans passing attack with downfield throws. Chimere Dike, also in this offense, is getting more and more involved. Every week he's behind the defense for 2 or 3 downfield throws, and every week Cam Ward has been missing him, but one of these weeks it's going to hit. DK is also the punt returner, the kick returner. Titans are one of the more attractive defenses this week for the cheap defenses, so you could pair them together. Dontavian Wicks, we know he's capable of putting up a big game, and it's a soft matchup here. So obviously the floor is low, but the ceiling is high. Kayshon Boutte played 37 snaps last week to Stephon Diggs, 30 snaps. Again, 3 targets per game each of the last 3 weeks, but the ceiling is still there. So kind of a lot of interest. Oh, and then Ryan Flanoy, who stepped in really, he played fewer snaps than Tolbert last week, but really stepped in as the number 2 wideout for this Cowboys offense. And I think he's very viable again this week as well. So an interesting low end range where, yes, we're throwing darts, but if one of these hits for 15 to 20 points and you've saved all that salary, you're really far ahead of the field. So I do think that it's viable to build some rosters down there this week as well. And to kind of piggyback off of that, I think it's viable, as always, but especially this week, to bet on the unexpected. That's kind of the nature of a week like this, is be willing to kind of go off the board a little bit. Okay, so that covers my sort of macro angle views on the slate. We're going to wrap up with my bottom-up build. If you're unfamiliar with this, we build with a $44K salary cap. We also have a bottom-up build contest at OWS, $100 to first place, free to enter. So there is no $44K salary cap restrictions on DraftKings, but we've actually talked to them in the past of like, could you do this for us? That would take a lot of work for a free contest for our users. So we do a regular 50K salary cap contest, but the rules are you got to build with 44K or less in salary for your roster to be eligible for the win. So you can find the link in the BUB Challenge channel on Discord or at the top of my player grid. Again, my player grid will be free this week, 1 week only. So check that out as well. Join us, build a 44K salary cap roster, see if you can beat us. Always targeting upside. It's always interesting when we get these weeks where somebody scores 200 plus points, spending 44K in salary. Let's try to do that here. So what we have here is I went with a Bryce Young, Rico Dowdle, Javonte Williams stack. Gives me an opportunity to talk about that. 3 of the last 4 times that Bryce Young has hit, that has been the way to play the Bryce Young stack, has been Bryce Young plus his running back plus the opposing team's running back. I could easily see that hitting in this spot as well. So Bryce Young, Rico Dowdle, Javonte Williams. We throw in Teteroa McMillan. He was actually the last piece on this roster because I had 6,100 in salary and he was 6K. So it fit well with what we were already doing. I went into this mid-range at running backs. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll go really cheap at a few spots on these rosters in order to fit in somebody like a Puka Nacua or one of these higher-priced, high-ceiling guys, because that's how we get those 200-plus point scores. But because I'm seeing Puka as a guy that I'm paying $8,700 for this week, expecting 22 to 27 points, yes, he can put up 40, but that's not why I'm rostering him. I didn't want to do that on a 44K salary cap contest because that kind of caps my expected ceiling. So I went to this 6K range across the board. It's kind of this 5K to 6K range of wide receivers. I went Teteroa McMillan, Quentin Johnston, Jalen Waddle, all guys capable of scoring 25 to 30 at these cheap price tags. Embrace some variance on this roster. See if we can get all these guys hitting together. Pretty low probability, but it certainly can happen. David Njoku, one of the best cheap tight end options this week. I'm even fine with Njoku in the flex at 3,500 because he is capable of putting up 8 to 12 points in most games, and he can put up 15, 17, 18, 20 points at 3,500. Great value there. Wrap it up with something we talked about earlier. Chimere, DK, and the Titans defense, 5.4K combined. If we get a return touchdown, that's 12 points right there. On top of that, DK can catch 2 passes for 100 yards and a touchdown, right? So there is a world in which DK puts up 27 DraftKings points and does it just one time all season, and people are chasing it next year, and we're on it early. So adding that to the Titans defense is nice. You get the double dip on the points, and that does it for my bottom-up bill. That's 43.9K in salary spent, 6.1K in salary left over. With that, we're going to get out of here. I am about to be on with Squirrel Patrol, so you can catch that on the 1 Week Season podcast feed, on the 4for4 podcast feed, YouTube feed, all that. And then my player grid, by the time you're watching this, might already be live on the site. It usually goes up around 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific time. So I will see you on my other podcast. I will see you on the site throughout the weekend, on the free player grids, and I will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.